Good morning and welcome to 20 Minutes on Fighting Disinformation. My name is Christopher Hammer. Today we'll be hearing from Jasper Jackson, who has done research on how Western investors have made massive earnings on pushing misinformation to drive advertising. This is an angle we don't think much about when in the middle of a conflict, but as we'll hear soon, there are many ways of profiting on war. Very briefly about Jasper, he is an investigative journalist specializing in technology and media. He was previously the assistant media editor for The Guardian and digital editor of The New Statesman. Jasper is today technology editor at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. And for new viewers, just to remind you that we are not taking any questions at the end of the session, so that we'll keep it short and sweet, and within the about 20 minutes that we set aside for the talk this morning. So with that being said, Jasper, we're all yours.
Hi, thanks very much, Christopher. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. Just another couple of points about the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. We're a non-profit organization that aims to sort of fill some of the gaps left by the lack of resources in the media industry. What I'm going to speak about today is the piece we've just recently released with The Guardian, my former employers, which details how Yandex, which is known as the Russian Google, is basically delivering advertising on a whole range of Russian websites that are pushing propaganda about the war. Yandex may be known as the Russian Google, but it's actually owned by some of the largest investment funds in the world, the kind of people who manage money for pension funds, for all sorts of investors, and hold trillions in assets. So effectively, this is a company that is owned by Western investors of the kind that are sanctioning Russia, yet it is directly pushing advertising money to these websites that are deliberately trying to influence the agenda negatively around the actual war. And these range from sort of state-owned sites through to those owned by oligarchs with a pro-Kremlin agenda. I'm just going to use this story to talk about a couple of different aspects. First, I'm going to talk about the kind of misinformation we discovered and sort of the narratives there. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what sort of happened actually since we did that research. And then I'm going to talk about the advertising aspect of all this, because I think it's really integral to some of the big issues we have around misinformation and disinformation more generally that we've seen over certainly the past few years. So, as I said, there are a number of different kinds of misinformation we came across. This is one of them, which was basically saying that NATO was effectively going to liquidate Serbia, was going to invade. This is on a website that was set up conveniently just after the 2014 invasion, previous invasion by Russia of the Donbass and Crimea. And it's set up by a Russian oligarch with close links to Putin, who is actually sanctioned and has been sanctioned by a range of different countries since 2014. And the audience for this is pretty obvious. It's within Russia. It's suggesting that NATO is an aggressive force, and also Serbia, because Serbia is a country that has historically close ties to Russia and has a potentially a population that might respond well to these kind of claims and believe Russian propaganda. Another example, and this one is really common, and you can see this is on an offshoot of SPUTNIK. SPUTNIK South Ossetia. It's a small offshoot, but the kind of content is very indicative of what you'd find elsewhere. And it's basically trying to suggest that the Ukrainians are Nazis who hate the sort of Russian inhabitants of the Donbass. This fits into the overarching narrative that Russia's been trying to portray, and also portrays its invasion as a defensive measure for the people of the Donbass. Another one similar here. This is basically a suggestion that the Ukrainians were going to carry out terrorist attacks in Belarus, again trying to justify Russian aggression. And then this one is a classic. This is again from a sort of Russian Orthodox tabloid TV channel that also runs this website. and this is the claim that effectively the US was running bioweapons labs in Ukraine, which again was quite a dominant narrative for a while. Again, arguing that there was a pretext for the invasion, arguing that America was a threat, and generally trying to suggest that the invasion is all for the good of the people of Ukraine and to protect Russia. And then this is the other classic one, which is basically Russia suggesting that absolutely everything is going completely to plan in the invasion. Clearly, we know that not to be the case. There's plenty of evidence for it, but Russia has consistently been arguing throughout, even when it was very clear that it was failing in most, if not all of its objectives, has been arguing that actually everything has been going strictly to plan. And that's still happening now. When they talk about the fact that they are potentially restricting their activity to the sort of south and east of the country, the argument is still that that has always been the plan and everything is going swimmingly. Now, the role these sites play is actually quite interesting because it's part of a broader information environment. This is a quote from Jane Litvenko, a former BuzzFeed journalist who's now at the Shorenstein Center. And the point she's trying to make is that these websites aren't necessarily the thing that will create the false impression initially. They help support the broader narratives that people are much more likely to see on social media. They provide a veneer of respectability. They give people something to quote, something to use in arguments. And so it reinforces viral messaging on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, on all the other different platforms. And this is always something we really need to remember about misinformation and disinformation, that these are part of large, complex systems, and the different channels and platforms interact with each other. So those are the different kinds of misinformation we came across. You've also got to think about RT as the big one that everyone talks about. And RT forms a really, really key role in the Russian disinformation ecosystem, because what it effectively does is it gives people this really quite clear idea that somehow, because they're on TV, they're being interviewed in a professional situation, they can be respectable. And this is a picture of Chris Williamson MP, a Labour MP in the UK, who was accused of anti-Semitism and was very much a fringe voice within the party. And he is just one of the figures that sort of spread misinformation, but often use their appearances on places like RT as a way to give themselves credibility. Now, we've seen more recently, since the shocking, sort of horrific images and facts coming out of places that Russia has retreated from, Bucha, various other places where there are clear evidence of war crimes, the murder of civilians, torture. And we've seen another classic misinformation, disinformation trope here, which is that the Russian government and pro-Russian sources have been suggesting and claiming that the footage that's come out is staged. Now, this is a real classic of misinformation and disinformation. We saw it, for instance, around Sandy Hook, the shootings in the US, the claims of crisis actors, people pretending to be injured or killed. And this is actually the Russian Defense Ministry, and they are claiming that in this instance they're claiming the evidence has been faked. That the fact that the video footage that came out or most recently came out, didn't come out until 4 days after the Russians pulled out. In the footage, there are some anomalies. There is a suggestion that a hand moves. These have all been explained due to basically a dot of water on the windscreen in one instance. There are artifacts created by compression for social media. The 4-day gap is not that surprising when Russia has been mining bodies and setting booby traps. But obviously, this is a classic tactic of disinformation. You effectively say that the information you don't like is in fact the fake news, as people like to call it. I think one of the things that's interesting about this is it's so very clearly part of the Russian playbook we've seen for years, which is very much their misinformation is aimed, certainly outside Russia, not really in controlling the narrative, but sowing doubt and uncertainty and providing people with a way to make their own arguments and cast doubt upon the narratives. And we will see lots more of this. This will be continuous. It's probably in many ways far more effective than claims about bioweapons labs, because there is a very receptive audience of people who believe that there are conspiracy theories that these kind of videos will be faked. And there are also many people who are prepared to push them and push these theories and talk about them because there's an audience out there. And so you're seeing more of this. You've got Russian TV doing this. You've got the foreign ministers basically pushing this narrative, and we'll just see lots of more of it. There is a key distinction, I think, that sort of needs to be made when we talk about disinformation and Russia around this war. There are two very separate audiences for Russian disinformation. That's the domestic audience within Russia and the international audience. And the disinformation serves very different purposes, I would argue. Within Russia, it is actually about trying to control the narrative. It is trying to convince the public that Russia's war is just, that they are dealing with Nazism in Ukraine. It's trying to suppress dissent and keep the population on side. I would argue, though, that actually internationally, that really isn't Russia's goal. They are always going to fail, to be honest, to convince large proportions of the public in, let's say, the UK or America, that the invasion is all a defensive maneuver and it's all, on behalf of the people of Ukraine, to protect the people of Ukraine. But what it does is it creates confusion, it creates a certain degree of uncertainty, it creates arguments, it creates conflict. And that's exactly what we've seen previously from Russian-sponsored disinformation. For instance, some of these small-scale examples we've had previously in America. Russia was funding anti-racism Facebook groups and right-wing Facebook groups. They weren't pushing any particular narrative. They were just trying to cause as much confusion and conflict as possible. And I think we'll see a lot of that around the Ukraine invasion in coming weeks, and for as long as the war lasts and well beyond that. So that's sort of my take on the information warfare so far. I want to talk a bit about the advertising ecosystem, because this is something that I think is really important for people to understand when we talk about misinformation. So Yandex ran an advertising network. It worked with a range of different organizations to deliver a range of different publishers, and also a range of different organizations that were placing ads on these sites. And what you have to understand here is that this whole system creates a set of incentives. As well as channeling money, it also taps into the way in which our online ecosystem functions. And it's also deeply untransparent. So here's a great example, the Loom escape, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, which is become something of a joke in the industry, but it shows you exactly how complex these advertising ecosystems are. And that complexity leads to a lack of transparency. And that lack of transparency leads you to this kind of stuff. So this is some work done by the Check My Ads Institute. You may have heard of them. They have this newsletter called Branded. I recommend you all subscribe to it, because what it's really great at doing is unpicking exactly how the advertising ecosystem is producing and funding and promoting misinformation. And they did a really great story last month, basically looking at how Google's ad network itself was placing ads from very respectable brands on a number of relatively niche, but quite clearly pro-Russia misinformation and propaganda websites. And the fact is that the advertisers themselves often have very little idea that this is happening, because the system is incredibly opaque. In many ways opaque by design, people would argue, because it's basically means that Google can make huge amounts of money out of the system without much accountability. We saw this exactly the same kind of stuff with COVID. You had huge big name brands on conspiracy websites, pushing conspiracy about vaccines, about COVID more generally. And these brands kind of go, oh no, this is terrible. We will have a word with Google. We will complain about this. And then you can do these kind of studies 6 months later, and you'll find exactly the same thing happening again and again. I would argue that these brands, in particular, not these brands, but brands generally, really aren't doing enough and aren't being held accountable enough for where both their ads and the money they spend on those ads is going. And the point about this is it makes misinformation both possible in a lot of cases because it's funded, but also it creates incentives to create misinformation, because misinformation inherently is often deeply appealing and can get you lots of eyeballs, lots of people coming to your website. And so if misinformation is what gets people to visit your website and gets people to look at the ads that you're getting money from, then you are going to be even keener to spread misinformation, disinformation than you would be if you have an agenda. So this is all really about our attention economy. The internet has been built around the requirement to get people to look at your content. You see it with Facebook, you see it with publisher websites. Your websites will all be built to some extent about trying to get people to look at a web page. The reason we have this system is because of the advertising underpinning it. And we've got to a point where we are effectively optimizing content for eyeballs. And that means optimizing our discourse and the things we say online, on Twitter, on Facebook, purely to get people to pay attention. And this is one of the things that's really driven the misinformation and disinformation environment, because fundamentally it creates a set of incentives that make creating misinformation, which make creating misinformation often quite profitable, and also the systems themselves are designed to drive people's attention towards things that generally create emotive responses, and very often that's going to be misinformation. I think we really need to address this fundamental issue with the internet, because it's going to continue leading to misinformation crises. We've seen it. We saw it around Trump. We've seen it around Brexit. We've seen it around COVID over the last 2 years, and now we're seeing it with Russia, Ukraine. And frankly, until we start looking really carefully at the way the internet is built and the business models that underpin it, we are not going to get a handle on these problems more broadly. And the next crisis will see exactly the same patterns emerge again. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jasper. Really appreciate it that you're sharing this piece of research with us, which is very, very interesting, but it's just as depressing as well at the same time. So thank you so much for taking the time to share this with us this morning.
Thanks.
Now, let's just look a little bit ahead. So next week, we have Easter coming up. Long Friday will be on most people's calendars next Friday. So we're taking a break then, and back again on the 22nd of April with a new speaker that we are preparing at the moment. So look out for our announcement on the name and title for that one. But I would also invite you all tuning into this. If you know someone in your network that would be a suitable contributor to our talks on Fridays, please let us know. Or maybe you are a good candidate. You have something that you would like to share. Do drop us a line, and we'll take it from there. So with that said, from all of us here at Media City Bergen, keep safe and stay healthy.